This is the scene in Westminster, where in just over an hour the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, will deliver what's almost certainly his last budget before the general election. We're with you until 3:30 this afternoon. This is Politics Live. With me in the studio now, the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam, and political editor, Chris Mason. And I'll be joined later by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and her Labour shadow. We'll hear from the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, plus expert analysis and reaction from the financial markets.
Is this an election-winning budget? Is this really a turning point, Chancellor?
And there is Jeremy Hunt with his Treasury team, all gathering in that traditional photo call, holding up in just a moment that red box, the traditional red box inside which is his budget, which he will unveil shortly in the House of Commons. But could today be a repeat of last year's autumn statement?
I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%.
Another 2p cut in national insurance is widely expected today. But could there be more? But with money tight in the midst of a recession, those giveaways are likely to be paid for by spending cuts and tax rises elsewhere. And with a general election imminent, how will the budget go down beyond Westminster?
I'm in Newcastle, hearing from local businesses and community leaders about what they want from the budget and getting their reaction to what the Chancellor announces.
Yes, it's budget day. The day has finally arrived. One of the few remaining set pieces where the government gets the opportunity to set out its agenda before the general election, whenever that happens. We'll talk about speculation on a date later on in the programme. It'll be important to hear how the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, presents the decisions that he makes today, because we've heard quite a lot about what's going to be in this budget. Let's give you a flavour of that on some of the front pages. The Times, Jeremy Hunt seeks to win over voters with £900 tax cut, a combination of 2p cut in national insurance now and in the autumn when he announced it. Jeremy Hunt, The Guardian, says defies public services alarm with pre-election budget tax cuts. This is the Financial Times. Hunt to put £10 billion tax cut, that's the cost, at core of budget as Tories eye tough election. And finally, The Telegraph. Tax cuts spark election talk. As I say, we'll certainly get into that in just a moment. Well, those are the headlines today. Chris and Faisal, there has, as always, been endless speculation and reports about particularly the issue of tax cuts and how far the Chancellor would go. It's certainly been obsessing Conservative MPs on this programme over the past few months. But it looks as if that cut is going to happen. What would you guess at tomorrow's headlines being once he has announced this budget, Chris?
They are likely to be, Ida. It's a good question, that. It's interesting to ponder what Jeremy Hunt would hope those headlines are versus what they turn out to be, not least because he's had a fair smattering of headlines, as you were just reflecting this morning, which could be, if you'd landed from another planet, that the paper's the day after a budget rather than the day of a budget. But given that we have been reporting since yesterday, you know, what is a substantial tax cut with this 2p from national insurance. The intriguing thing for me is there any scope for something else around the whole question of a tax for workers? So Labour are saying, oh, you know, they've done some number crunching. They reckon that his room for manoeuvre might be a little greater than he's been letting on. Does that allow an extra penny somewhere else, potentially on income tax? The argument that others make in government is no, that isn't, in their judgment, their choice, affordable, and therefore maybe instead there's talk of that being a prospect down the track, either in another quote-unquote fiscal event before an election or something that the Conservatives talk about in terms of a manifesto.
And is that because the 2p cut that he announced, we heard there in the autumn statement that has only really just come in, that cut to national insurance that we've already had, hasn't moved the dial for them?
It hasn't moved the dial, so there's a fear amongst Conservative MPs that whatever they do now, a substantial chunk of the electorate are simply not listening. Now, you might argue that if you can't move the dial much with 2p, maybe you can if it's a combined 4p on national insurance. And there's a counter-argument that says it might not have moved the dial in a positive sense for the Conservatives, but maybe the dial would be more negative if it hadn't happened. And therefore, maybe it did move the dial, it just left the dial where it was as opposed to it slipping sort of more negatively. They're going to make a broader argument that says, look, this shows where our instincts lie. This is what we aspire to do when we judge the conditions allow it to happen.
What's the message, broadly, that Jeremy Hunt will want to get across today, which may be reflected in tomorrow's papers?
Well, I'm very struck by the use of this word, as we expect, of the phrase, I should say, turning point. Because actually, that conversation you just had with Chris kind of gets to that, which is 2p didn't move the dial, but 4p, you start to kind of get further along the curve of a turning point of taxes, which, let's be clear, have gone up substantially. Accompanying a bigger state, which the Conservatives say was not our instincts, but was a necessity as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the energy shock from the Russia invasion of Ukraine. We have a bigger state, we have higher taxes. We're starting to turn that around.
Right.
So that's the message on taxes, but then in the backdrop, the message, which is tougher, particularly because of the move into recession, is that the economy has started to turn too. And then there's all sorts of arguments there about how much people will feel that, how much they'll give credit to the government, how much they'll blame global factors versus whoever happens to be in government.
Well, and you mentioned recession. Not an ideal backdrop, I'd put to you, for any Chancellor to be unveiling a financial statement, a budget. Let's just show our viewers this graph, because it's titled Economic Growth Since Rishi Sunak Became Prime Minister. Of course, he was Chancellor before that. And you can see there, since 2022, the end of 2022, I mean, economic growth has been bumping pretty well along the bottom. But crucially, and importantly, those last two quarters of 2023, Q3, Q4, it drops into negative growth. And of course, the definition is that if you have two consecutive quarters of negative growth, it's a recession. Difficult to see how you sell a turning point when we're in recession.
Yes, I mean, presentation, extremely difficult for the government to say that. The bigger picture, as you showed in that chart, is zero. And if what we had at the end of last year is only a technical recession, just a dip into recession, and the flip side of that is we've only had technical growth, really, and that's going to continue for the next couple of quarters. We may well already be out of this recession, but this flat picture makes you susceptible to these dips into recession. And in general, that flat picture is what the Chancellor says he's going to try to deal with a tax cut focused on workers, and becomes one of the key background arguments for the election. What the opposition plans for growth would be too.
Well, and of course we'll get to that with both a minister and shadow minister. The question at the heart of this, which is the old Ronald Reagan question, is do you feel better off? Do people feel better off after 14 years of Conservative governments, or even just the last year or so? Now, the reason they might not is because of what's happened to inflation. And again, we can show viewers the inflation consumer prices index. If we take you back to 2021, look at the figure there, 0.7% at the beginning of 21. And of course, for the reasons we know, a pandemic, a war in Ukraine, the energy shock, in part has contributed to this whopping rise in inflation, which peaked in October 2022 at 11.1%. It's come down quite substantially to 4% in January, the target being 2%. Now, this, of course, is the rate of inflation.
No, I think it is important to note that is a turning point, because in previous experiences of double-digit inflation, it has lasted for a year or two. There's a point I made when it reached 10%, and it hasn't this time. Now, how much credit goes to the government versus the Bank of England versus the general
we always like to say they take credit when it comes down and, of course, distance themselves when it goes up.
That's a matter for the electorate. But it wasn't preordained that 11% would come down. There are global factors, as you rightly point out, on the downside. But if you're going to have the disbenefit of having the blame for it hitting 11%, maybe there's some soupçon of benefit you get for having gone down.
Except, do people feel better off? Because prices are still rising. They're rising in the main, albeit more slowly, because we can show, though, look at these three sort of important key fundamentals. Since 21 and 24, over the last 3 years, 20% increase in clothing, 31% increase in food, and food inflation has been particularly stubborn, and because of that energy shot, 90% increase in energy. Will people feel better off?
Probably not, is the truth. So people will feel all of the things that these charts reveal, that you have a situation where the tax burden has been through the roof, where the cost of living is significant, and that backdrop is sufficiently dominant that it's incredibly difficult for a Chancellor, and even a couple of quote-unquote fiscal events, as Westminster likes to call them, autumn statements, budgets, to fundamentally shift that bigger picture. Instead, they can try and point to a direction of travel, both economically and politically, which I think we'll get quite a lot of from the Chancellor at lunchtime, as we did in the autumn. But that backdrop is so significant because the events that shaped it, as Faisal was talking about, have been so significant, whether it's the pandemic or the war in Ukraine, or indeed, as we saw, politically, all of the stuff around Liz Truss's tenure in government, that shifting that economic and political backdrop for Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt is incredibly difficult.
I actually put this question directly to the Chancellor on the day of the growth figures when the recession was confirmed. He said something quite interesting. He pushed further. He's normally very careful when he's talking about the Bank of England. But he said to me, I don't know the direct quote, but it was something like the turning point will come when the Bank of England start to cut interest rates. Okay, which is a bit of a nudge there. As I said, he's normally careful. Now, what's happened is, as well as the chart you showed showing all the different kind of commodities prices, obviously mortgage costs have gone up significantly. And we're talking hundreds of pounds per month. Now, that is an extraordinary amount. Context here, our national insurance cuts, even if you add both of them together, we're talking £90 a month. Now, that is noticeable on hundreds of pounds a month. Non-negligible, I would say, but it's still, you weigh that up, but it's almost like they're waiting for the Bank of England to cut, to kind of confirm to the nation that we have turned a corner.
Is there any indication of when that might be? People have talked about June, the sort of summertime, which could, of course, be another factor in when the election may be called, but that would be an important moment.
Despite the fact, as you showed, inflation is coming to target, the mood music we get from them is that they're just waiting to be absolutely sure that inflation hasn't spread everywhere and isn't more enduring. So.
And inflation, of course, cutting it. We've just seen Rishi Sunak there leaving number 10 on his way, making that short journey to the Palace of Westminster there.
Curiously, the Prime Minister seems to have managed to leave the front door without incident. I was in Downing Street about half an hour ago, Joe, and the Chancellor came out to do his famous moment with the raising of the red box and his team of ministers. And the car was there, just down the street, his snappers waiting to get the moment of the Chancellor walking with his red box to the Range Rover, get in it and head off. And he turned round and went back into number 11, stood with his nose pressed against the door for a few seconds. Well, I don't know, had he left the gas on? I don't know. Then had to knock on his own front door, went back in.
Oh, you didn't let him in then?
No, and then 30 seconds later, emerged out of number 10.
Well, of course, it's convenient, isn't it, that you can move seamlessly from number 11 to
I like on these days of high choreography that you get splashes of absurdity, as well as all of the, the numbers and all the rest of it that we're going to get shortly.
Well, and high drama. And actually, just on a point on Rishi Sunak, because, of course, he was former Chancellor, and Jeremy Hunt, and how closely they've worked together on this particular budget. The tension in terms of perhaps how far to go in terms of any tax cuts, whether they're right or wrong.
When you have a Prime Minister who, when he was campaigning to be Prime Minister, talked about a desire to cut income tax. Now, cutting income tax, you speak to loads of Conservative MPs, say that makes for a better headline, it's more instantly understandable. The catch is it's more expensive, and there's the danger that it might be inflationary as well. So, that tussle, that juggle has been going on, and we'll see the extent to which it plays out, both in what is announced today, but then it might also be trailed for the future, in an hour or so.
Well, that is the scene and all the debate here in Westminster, but it is an election year, and everything that the government and the opposition parties do is always closely defined by what that election strategy might be and what people beyond Westminster think of what will be announced today in that all-important budget. Let's go to the North East, to Newcastle, speak to our political correspondent there, Luke Walton. He is testing the temperature of people, business people and community leaders in Newcastle. Over to you, Luke.
Joe, I'm on the balcony of the Pitcher and Piano Bar on the iconic Tyne quayside, those famous bridges behind me. A bit cold and damp here in Newcastle this morning. So can the budget be a ray of sunshine? Well, I'm with three people with very different perspectives on that. First of all, Andy Radcliffe, you are the Chief Executive of S Group, which is a builder and a housing developer based in County Durham. What do you want to see from the Chancellor?
Well, as you'd expect, I'd like to see some support for housing to help us deliver the volume of housing that we desperately need in the country. The private housing market is in a kind of state of disarray at the moment as it adjusts to the new reality of interest rates at levels that we haven't really seen for coming on 20 years. There is talk of a 99% mortgage guarantee scheme, which may have some merit, but unless lenders come forward with products that are more attractive for buyers, I can't see it having a significant impact on demand. And actually the Help to Buy scheme that was in previously was a much more impactful scheme that the government introduced.
Of course, levelling up was the big promise from the Conservatives to this part of the world. Are you seeing that, and do you want more of it?
Well, certainly. I mean, we've actually seen some good success in the level up bids in the North East particularly. And actually the scheme that we're carrying out over here, the major refurbishment of the Tyne Bridge that we've just started on, is an example of some major investment in the North East. But of course we need more. We have some world-class businesses in the North East, but we need to invest in infrastructure, in connectivity to allow them to attract the investment and the talent that they need to thrive.
And talking about investment, clearly there is this speculation that actually, in terms of long-term public spending, that may be squeezed in this budget. Would that worry you in terms of as a company that gets involved with infrastructure building?
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to level up the country, we need to invest in these major projects that attract investment and attract people, build housing that people can live and work in the right places. So yes, it's actually quite a concern if we have to see a depressed level of investment, certainly in the North East.
Well, Amanda Bailey, you are the director of the North East Child Poverty Commission, which researches and lobbies on that issue. What would you like to see from Jeremy Hunt?
I think we need to hear what the plan is for children and young people, and particularly children and young people on the very lowest incomes in places like the North East. You know, we all know that the North East can be the most fantastic place to live, to grow up, to raise a family, but it isn't for everybody. And until we make it a place where every child and young person can reach their potential, we're not going to do that as a region as a whole. And the reality is that our region has seen the steepest increases in child poverty of anywhere in the country over most of the last decade. And actually 1 in 5 children in the North East are living in what's known as deep or very deep poverty. And that level of inequality and hardship is just not acceptable in what remains one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
These are very deep-seated long-term problems, though. What could the Chancellor do today that actually make a difference?
In the immediate term, we need to see an urgent extension of something called the Household Support Fund. That's helped families in immediate crisis over most of the last 2 years.
And that's due to end, actually.
It's currently due to end at the end of this month. But in the longer term, we need what's the bigger picture and what's the bigger vision for children and young people. We need a government that's prepared to commit to ending child poverty, to a cross-government, cross-departmental, ambitious plan to say that, you know, this is wrong, that we have this level of inequality in our country, and particularly in places like the North East, and we're going to invest in children and families to improve that.
And when you hear that public sector spending may be squeezed in some departments in coming years, what does that raise for you?
I think that's really concerning. We know that all the services and support that families and children rely on are already overstretched in our region, whether that's schools, colleges, youth services, local authorities. I think what's particularly concerning is that that's going to be stretched by paying the price of a national insurance cut that will disproportionately not benefit the North East. So we may pay the price of a cut that actually benefits people in London and the South East the most.
Well, Johnson Fernandez, you're the founder of Equiwatt, a Gateshead-based tech firm. You're very much a growing company, a new company. What can the Chancellor do to actually encourage more businesses like that to this part of the world?
Yeah. So it's a challenging time, right, for everyone, isn't it? So what I would like to see is commitment to continue spend on innovation, because spending on innovation creates more businesses like us, creates more jobs, and then, that's how the economy can move forward.
You were telling me that actually being based in Gateshead is actually harder to attract investment, perhaps, than it would be if you were based in London.
Yes, that's right. And that's all part of the leveling up, isn't it? So, we need more connectivity, more presence of investors, more regional funds, so that we can, retain talent as well as acquire new talent and then grow our business. So, yeah.
I suppose the big headline we know about is this national insurance cut, yet another national insurance cut. Is that good news for your company and your staff?
Again, challenging times, right? So households are trying to, reduce the spend on clothing, energy bills, and we've seen that evidence in our business, where, by reducing energy demand at peak times, households can get pennies which add up. And this is the same measure that the government is trying to do by focusing on the sum of marginal gains on things like the national insurance. I think that's a great way forward.
Well, Johnson Fernandez, thank you, and thank you to all my guests. A long wish list there for the Chancellor. We'll find out very soon how much of it he can deliver. Joe.
Thank you very much, Luke. And of course, we'll return to you and your guests after the budget and get their reaction. Just listening there, getting a flavour, Faisal, of what certainly business people would like to see. Where are we in terms of levels of investment? What can they really hope for?
Well, Britain still has a productivity problem, which is the kind of foundation for rising living standards and growth and rising GDP per capita, the size of the economy per person. And that is why the Chancellor devoted half of his tax-cutting kind of energy and power and funding towards business expensing in the last autumn statement. We're not going to get anything like that again. There isn't the space. This is focused on personal tax cuts today. Although within that, the focus is on workers. So they hope that helps to not solve, but ameliorate one of the key problems in the economy, which is the shortage of workers. Put this together, by my calculations, you're talking kind of like maybe 50, 60,000 extra workers, hundreds of thousands of extra hours worked as a result of something focused on working. But there are some other reforms around the edges. There's this talk of a British ISA, which would focus the tax subsidies to saving at investments in the UK. That's very interesting. Returns to UK investments have been pretty poor in the stock market, and a lot of people with savings have chosen to go and invest in the American stock market and other stock markets which have been growing faster. So that will be, in a niche but important audience, a big thing if he goes through with that. He's been hinting at that for some time.
Well, let's return to the issue of tax. And let's show our viewers this graph. Tax as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of the economy. You can see there again, historically, if you go back to 1990, 1991, at the end of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, into John Major at 30.4%, climbing to 32.4% after, or during, I should say, the financial crash, into the coalition government. But then you see the figure there, 28, 29 in those years, rising to what would be a historic high of 37.7%. That's what's forecast there by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now, people might ask, Chris, but we've got all these tax cuts being announced in national insurance. But it's not going to make a difference, is it, to the overall tax burden because of two very important things, including these tax thresholds that have been frozen?
Exactly. So it's back to that thing that the big picture is very hard for the Chancellor to shift. So he will announce tax cuts, and there's headlines about tax cuts, but that chart tells the bigger picture story that the tax burden for lots of people is higher than it's been in their lifetimes or for generations, and that takes some shifting. Now, it comes back to those big picture observations about the absence of growth, about the recent once in a generation, once in 100-year type events like the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. It means, though, what you'll get, the argument from Labour being, is one of, as you were mentioning it a few minutes ago, do you feel better off? Are you not paying more tax than you were X number of years ago. Now, that will vary depending on your own personal circumstances, but they believe that that's an argument that has resilience, such as the significance of the backdrop, which means it's so hard for a Chancellor to shift. But worth emphasising, on a day where we talk about the choices that the government faces, the choices that an opposition party faces. So
yes,
we've seen a critique.
they may inherit all this.
Well, yeah, and they've made a critique. Keir Starmer has made a critique that he says the government is salting the earth, in his view, with some of the things that the Conservatives are choosing to do. But what we'll hear from Labour later is that they agree with the idea of cutting taxes for workers.
Because they think the overall tax burden is too high as well.
Indeed. So they will choose to back that, but in so doing create a question for them about their own spending plans and what they therefore do if they win the election. So yes, there'll be some rhetoric from them, no doubt, about this idea of salting the earth, but at the same time they are choosing to accept elements of what the government is going to announce, when they could, if they wanted to, say, no, we wouldn't cut taxes here because we think the money should be spent elsewhere. But they don't want to do that.
No, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, I just want to show our viewers one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, that the Chancellor is so limited in terms of his manoeuvrability and what he can do. Let's have a look at this graph on debt. Also, as a percentage of the nation's economy of GDP. You can see in 22-23, so up to last year, 84.9%, and it increases with each year, reaching a peak of 93.2%. And then you'll notice in 2028-29, it comes down marginally. Explain to us, Faisal, exactly what is meant when Jeremy Hunt talks about his fiscal rules, the rules that guide him in terms of what he can do when it comes to things like tax cuts, or perhaps putting any money that might be available in that forecast into public services, which it looks as if he's not going to do. Explain to us why it's significant.
These rules are meant as a kind of commitment device to everybody kind of in the markets, to people actually within the government themselves, to say we're going to keep the public finances in order in general terms. And they come in different guises, and we've had them under Labour governments and we've had them under Conservative governments, and they will continue whoever wins the election. And they're designed to sort of, if you like, send to the markets the general sense that you're kind of in control, that you won't let this go out of control. When you have a debt to GDP ratio close to 100% and you have low growth, those are the conditions where people can get a little concerned about where borrowing is going. So you set these rules. This debt rule is the one that is biting right now. There are other ones, but this is the one that matters. And as you explained, and is somewhat curious, it's kind of measured by the difference between what happens in the fourth year and the fifth year. And that equates, so it's a fall of 0.4% of GDP,
yes,
which equates to the £13 billion we'll be hearing a lot about. Now, there are all sorts of questions about whether that makes much sense. The 13 billion is, in fact, the difference between two massive numbers.
Yes, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies said it's an odd rule, is what they've called it.
Well, and you get an incentive to kind of play the rule rather than work out what it is that you want to do. But in general terms, what it does is it gives you a path of debt that is not going up. It's kind of stabilising, and then it kind of falls at the end. But to make very fine-tuned judgments on 5 or 6 billion here or 7 billion here, well, that is, you know, was that really the intent of people behind those rules, is the first thing. The reason why it's binding, though, is that the Chancellor has chosen to use up the space that he had. He had better forecasts than he thought, and he spent it on those tax cuts last time.
Choices.
Where this is going to end up, we think today, is that room is going to be extremely tight potentially as it has been, way below the average, and that creates some risks if the forecast goes in the wrong direction.
Chris?
Just one quick observation, picking up on that chart that we've just seen, which plays into how people feel about the economy right now, which is that when you have a lot of debt, you're paying a lot in debt interest.
Absolutely.
Which gets to part of the argument as to why you might feel that you're paying rather a lot of tax but not seeing a huge amount of it back in terms of how you might judge public services, because quite a lot of money is going on servicing the interest on the national debt.
All right, let's just go into the chamber in the House of Commons. It's filling up, of course, as you would expect, ahead of Prime Minister's questions, which will be coming up in 15 minutes' time. And I should think the Speaker will be disciplined, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, in terms of timing as usual so that Jeremy Hunt can get to his feet and deliver the budget at 12:30. We expect him to speak for about an hour, and then it will be the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, who will respond to what they've heard. Now, we are joined by two MPs in Central Lobby, just outside the chamber there, to get their views. Therese Coffey, Conservative MP, former Deputy Prime Minister, and Labour MP Rebecca Long-Bailey, who served in the former Labour leader's shadow cabinet. Welcome to both of you. Therese Coffey, we've just been talking about how limited the room is for the Chancellor and the fact that this budget is being announced against a backdrop of recession. As part of the Liz Truss government, are you in part to blame for what is now a very, very difficult straitjacket for Jeremy Hunt?
So let's just think about the challenges that the government is facing. And while the Prime Minister was Chancellor, I remember in Cabinet he was talking about the risks of inflation, how that would challenge us on debt repayments. But also we should recognise that inflation has principally been driven by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the impact that has had, not in energy costs, but in other ways of supply chains around the world. And indeed, I'm very conscious that the cost of living challenge has been one of the main drivers in actually whether it was about when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, the significant amount of money paid to help people with their energy costs, both in their homes but also in businesses, but also the significant decisions that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak made together, which were the right ones with the furlough scheme and the support to keep British business going.
Right.
So there's a combination of factors
but you
that has now taken longer perhaps than some of these issues went on longer than was perhaps originally thought of when, say, things like the furlough scheme. It's also challenging to bring down inflation. And meanwhile, we've been increasing things like our defence spending, supporting our friends in Ukraine, when, if I remind you, a decade ago, the world did not help Ukraine at that time.
Right,
so there's a combination of factors, and that's why today has to be, how can we get stuff done within government better, I think, to get on with the building the hospitals, but also to get that growth the economy needs.
But you accept,
Labour needs growth as well as the Conservatives do.
Therese Coffey, you accept, I think, just about that tax-cutting budget of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, of which you were part, shocked the markets, sparking a run on the pound, sending borrowing costs spiralling and forcing the Bank of England to intervene in the bond market, has made things even more difficult. You accept that?
That's not what I said very straightforwardly, Joe. What I'm saying is that the Prime Minister, inflation did go up. That was primarily driven by illegal invasion of Ukraine.
All right.
And I'm conscious that some of these things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years, COVID went on a lot longer than was expected. So it's that combination of factors, and we should bear in mind that the UK economy has been growing than most of the G7, faster than most of the G7. But we're still in that technical recession, and that's what we need to stimulate.
We're in recession. I mean, just briefly,
well,
before
as
I
the
get
Bank
to
of
you,
England governor said to the Treasury Select Committee, it's a technical recession, and not particularly, they're not even sure they are in recession.
Well,
because these things
we've
might
been
change.
in recession for ages. If you're calling it technical, we've been bumping along the bottom. I mean, Rebecca,
No, that's not true either, Joe.
Well, hang on. You were in Rebecca Long-Bailey. You were in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, and of course, he led the Labour Party to the worst election defeat in recent times. Do you think that's the reason that Labour, under Keir Starmer, is so very cautious in terms of what they are offering the electorate if they win the next election?
I think it's right to be cautious, but it's also right to offer a bold vision of national renewal, and that's what we're going to need after 14 years of this government. Today, I think we're going to see another budget that promises high wages, high growth, and they've been promising that for the last 14 years. Yet we've got an economy that is stagnating, we've got public services that are on the verge of collapse due to cuts and chronic underfunding, and we've got everyday ordinary working people struggling to get by in a cost of living crisis. What this budget should be about today is about national renewal. It won't be, it's about election gimmicks for the Conservative Party, sadly, and paying for tax cuts out of public service sector cuts.
Right. So, Rebecca Long-Bailey, would you and should the Labour Party oppose those tax cuts and not vote in favour of them?
Well, it depends what tax cuts he's going to outline, frankly.
A 2p cut on national insurance.
Well, these are certainly the things that have been trailed over the last 24 hours, and my concern about that is not that I'd oppose them, it's that they disproportionately affect the wealthiest earners. So, for example, somebody who's earning £25,000 a year can look to get a saving of £250, whereas an MP, for example, could be getting £700 a year, and that is not acceptable. It's not helping the poorest and most vulnerable in society, and it's not creating a high-wage economy. What the Chancellor should be looking at is increasing the living wage to, for example, £15 an hour, which is what the TUC is calling for. He should set out a national mission to end in-work poverty. So whilst I wouldn't disagree with the national insurance cut per se, it has to come as part of a wider package to really boost people's incomes and living standards.
Is a 2p cut in national insurance enough to turn Conservative fortunes around, Therese Coffey?
Well, I think the focus is really about how can we help people continue to have this challenge of the cost of living. And if you think about how national insurance is applied, I think you will have to earn about £185 a week, and after that you start to pay national insurance. So this will help people part-time, this will help people who do a lot of seasonal work have more in their pay packet every month. And that is important. At the same time, we are starting to see energy costs come down. So there's been a variety of things that have come together and have really coalesced in this challenging time. But I think it's important that we continue to help people with that cost of living, but also to make sure that we have real focus on growth and unlocking the economy, and that includes some of the processes within government too.
Right. I mean, you've already cut 2p. It was announced in the autumn statement. It's come and people are feeling it in their pay packets, Therese Coffey, but it didn't change anything in the polls. You're still languishing 20 to 25 points behind Labour.
Well, clearly, I'm sure that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor would like to see our poll ratings go up. Of course they would. But this is also being driven by principles about trying to make sure that we help people, particularly at this challenging time, with the cost of living. It's why we've seen people have only seen the effect of that twice so far, and because it's monthly, it may not seem that much, but it is something giving back to them. Right. The other thing that happened in the autumn statement, we probably are not quite yet at that stage of the full year expensing. That will start to come as businesses realign some of their investment in capital, again to stimulate this long-term growth that we desperately need to get back on that positive track. And that's why I think together Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will have put together a budget that's in the national interest. Of course, I want that to be the Conservative Party reflecting well from that, but more importantly is the national interest, the long-term plan. And frankly, at the moment, Labour isn't saying much at all on what they're going to do with the economy. That will be for them to answer.
Yeah, of course. But Rebecca, on that, I mean,
speculate.
Therese Coffey is right that you're not going to, as you yourself have said, oppose any of the measures in terms of tax cuts today. What's the difference between Labour and the Conservatives? There's nothing to pick between the two of you.
We'll set out our stall in detail before a general election, but there's a huge difference. We've got an economy that is being driven over the edge of a cliff by a government that has completely lost its way. It has no ideas whatsoever, whereas the Labour Party has set out a bold plan for national renewal. And that's not to say
that the Green Growth Plan's been dropped. That was part of your bold offering and it's gone.
And that's something that I feel very sad about, because I think one of the most important things that we should be doing to rebuild our economy is focusing heavily on industrial strategy, and it's about making wise investment decisions. Now, the pledge hasn't been dropped completely. There's still going to be that national investment package, but it does need to be bolder. If we're going to really tackle the productivity crisis that you've been speaking about earlier on your programme, that requires a national investment plan, it requires industrial strategy, and along with that will come with an increase in prosperity for everyone. But we need a government that's bold enough to do that. This government isn't. The Labour Party hopefully will be.
Rebecca Long-Bailey and Therese Coffey, thank you very much. There at Central Lobby. I'll let you take your places for Prime Minister's questions coming up in just over 5 minutes' time. And then, as I said, half an hour later, we expect Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, to get to his feet and unveil his budget. What did you make of what you heard there from Therese Coffey and Rebecca Long-Bailey, Chris?
It's just fascinating, isn't it? It's a reminder that so many political parties, not least the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, are broad tents. So you have two contributors there whose principal recent loyalties were to recent failed leaders of the two respective parties in reality, and so you hear a splash of loyalty in the direction of their current front benches.
Well, it is an election year, of course.
Well, indeed, coupled with a desire to maintain what they might see as a sort of respectable distance because they have their own authentic disagreements with their own front bench and a loyalty to the front bench that they served just a couple of years ago.
Right. Well, what's interesting, of course, as we always know, there are choices in politics, however tight the spending envelope. And Rebecca Long-Bailey saying she wouldn't oppose cuts to national insurance to working people, but maybe she would like to see a future Labour government, commit to higher public spending. Let's just have a look at this graph here. Changes in day-to-day spending on public services, because these tax cuts will have to be paid for by either tax rises or cuts in public spending or borrowing, but Jeremy Hunt has sort of parked that. Now, these figures, just to explain, are the figures as they are now. They will change, no doubt, once Jeremy Hunt has unveiled his budget. Now, what you can see in 27-28, pencilled in, as we say, in the trade, Jeremy Hunt, 1% increase in day-to-day spending across departments above inflation. But, as we know, there are what we call protected departments. Protected, the NHS, schools, defence, overseas aid, which will get more than that, because they are protected areas, leaving unprotected areas like the Home Office, like Justice, with that level of cuts. And they could be quite serious, couldn't they?
They could, and these are all assumptions based on the level of protection continuing, which we don't know. To be clear, and sort of infamously in our circles, the head of the OBR told MPs that the plans for spending after the election were essentially worse than fiction, in the sense that fiction is actually written down. I know that ruffled some feathers in the government, but he was trying to make the point that if you're going to have permanent tax cuts, you should back them up with credible spending plans. Now, I think the Chancellor's going to really lean into this argument. He doesn't want to run away from it. He's going to say, yes, we think the state has got bigger because of the reasons we explained. The tax burden's got bigger. We now think from this starting point, it's got to come down, and that's the difference. Now, isn't this interesting? Because if we can take our minds back 4 or 5 years, the plan was to increase national insurance to over 13% to pay for, remember social care, the social care plan? To pay for that. Where's that gone? You know, and that is a symbol of a different time under Boris Johnson, where there were some arguments.
Well, he expanded
Sunak.
obviously he expanded the state's...
But he wanted to do something to face a crisis in social care, which was impacting upon the NHS, and the method through which they were going to do that quite openly was to raise national insurance. Now, what's going to happen to that?
Quite. And it's back to your point, Joe, about things being penciled in. There's a lot of pencils used in and around Whitehall with all of these things, because so often, as Faisal was reflecting, looking back on the last couple of years, how much has changed, every likelihood that will happen into the future, and then from the Chancellor's point of view, teasing out some political dividing lines, but also doing that basic thing of human psychology, which is sort out today's problem before you worry about tomorrow.
Well, and you used the expression, I think, salted...
quoting Keir Starmer from earlier in the year.
And I mean, that is the potential headache. Well, it is going to be a headache if they do win the election, because they will be making these choices again a little bit further down the line, which is why they don't want to commit to anything in terms of spending. But those spending choices will be there, won't they?
They will, absolutely. But and shaped by the choices they also make today for exactly that same sort of basis in human psychology about the politics of now versus the headaches of tomorrow.
But they do have a choice over the fiscal rule. I mean, it is the choice of Rachel Reeves to say we're going to stick to the rule and we're going to stick to the baseline. And so therefore we inherit pretty much the same spending plans. And so are we in a sort of 1997 style situation
where they did inherit
where famously Ken Russell wasn't even going to stick to those spending plans.
And that comes back to a point of human psychology for Labour, in which they are conscious of being perceived to be vulnerable on the economy, so they hug a Conservative government pretty close. But that is a political choice.
Let's just have a look at what we expect in the budget. Just before Prime Minister's questions, I'll just keep an eye. A 2p reduction in national insurance contributions, which we've spoken about at length. A reduction in future spending increase. We've just been talking about that in order to pay for another tax cut on national insurance. Windfall tax on oil and gas extended to raise more money. Restricting non-dom tax status, restricting rather than abolishing. We'll come on to that. It's a Labour policy, but it may be stolen by the Conservatives. And a tax on vapes and an increase in tobacco duty. Tax-raising measures there also to raise money to pay for those tax cuts. Relax rules on capital reserves for banks. And this is also, extending the freeze on fuel duty. Well, it's been extended year after year. What was temporary looks permanent. Tax breaks for holiday lets scrapped. Yes, those tax perks may well go. There's been some opposition to that, and £362 million investment for manufacturing. Finally, we can see Jeremy Hunt has now taken his seat, £800 million to reduce public sector waste. If we show you inside the chamber, you can see there Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has taken his seat. He is ready to stand up and deliver this budget. There is, of course, maybe a little bit hackneyed, Chris, to talk about a surprise.
Oh, the rabbit?
The rabbit. We're not allowed to say rabbit, but yeah, apparently.
Days like this where I get asked, what's the rabbit out of the hat going to be?
It's escaped.
Well, arguably at least one fluffy creature with big ears has been wandering around SW1 for the best part of the last 24 hours. Yeah. The question is there any others? I remember watching a speech at a party conference a little while ago, and I was told, there's a rabbit. There's a rabbit in this particular speech. Afterwards I said, did I just
blink and miss it?
It was. I think a smaller creature than a rabbit would be a reasonable description of what this surprise thing was. But who knows what?
There's one suggestion here from Kate Ferguson at The Sun, who has tweeted, "Sounds like Jeremy Hunt's budget bunny out of the hat will be reformed to the child benefit charge. At the moment, parents have to start paying child benefit back once they earn £50,000. So a pitch to middle-earning mums and dads." You're nodding away there.
There's been some big campaigning on this. It not just is a charge, it's also a massive red tape challenge that, frankly, some were arguing HMRC was not being able to cope with. People were phoning up, finding themselves, this is part of the fiscal drag story, people who didn't expect themselves to be were being dragged into this and finding that they had to hand back their child benefit and you have to register on HMRC.
Well, let's go in for PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, including listening to the Chancellor's budget statement, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Charlotte Nettles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK used to be a world leader in psilocybin research, but despite the calls from the Home Affairs Select Committee, leading researchers, charities and veterans organisations and the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we've shamefully fallen behind on breakthrough treatment for conditions like PTSD and depression, causing misery to millions of people in our country. Can the Prime Minister explain why this policy remains the responsibility of a Home Office that can't give it the attention it deserves, and why it's OK that American, Canadian and Australian patients can access treatment British patients can't?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I completely sympathise and understand why people suffering from distressing conditions will want to seek the best possible treatment available, and I thank the Honourable Lady for raising the issue. We are committed to ensuring that the UK is a world-leading jurisdiction for pharmaceutical, clinical and other medical research, and we have, in fact, asked the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs to review barriers to legitimate medical research involving controlled drugs such as psilocybin. Our response to the Council's recommendations, I'm pleased to tell the Honourable Lady, will be published as soon as possible.
Dr. Kiranda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency has a long and proud history of farming, with generations of the same family helping to feed our nation. And not since World War II have we been so aware of how important food security is to our national security. So will the Prime Minister update the House on what his government is doing to support our fantastic farmers?
Mr. Speaker, as I set out at the NFU conference just a couple of weeks ago, we will always back British farmers to continue to produce fantastic food. We're accelerating that plan with the largest package of grants ever, and indeed one of those new schemes opens just today, supporting farmers with up to £125,000 towards the purchase of new equipment and technology. Our schemes in England are all about more choice, Mr. Speaker, not less, and unlike Labour in Wales, we will never introduce top-down arbitrary targets that damage farm incomes, damage our food security and take farmers back to square one.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years ago, Sarah Everard was walking home when she was abducted and murdered by a serving police officer who should have been trusted to keep her safe. As a father, I can't imagine the pain her parents, her family and her friends are going through in this difficult anniversary week. Lady Angelina's report exposes the appalling failure in police vetting and in misconduct processes. And I'm very troubled by its conclusion that there is, and I'm going to quote it, nothing to stop another Cousins operating in plain sight. How can that be the case 3 years on from this horrendous crime?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I firstly say that I'm sure all members of the House will have been thinking about Sarah Everard in recent weeks. It was, as the Honourable Gentleman said, an absolutely shocking case, and the abuse of power in particular was appalling. That's why we took action quickly, Mr. Speaker, to strengthen police vetting, strengthen the rules for rooting out officers who are not fit to serve, and conducted the largest ever screening of all serving officers and staff. We're now ensuring that any officer who has been charged for a crime will be suspended from duty automatically until their case is concluded, and we will thoroughly consider all of the report's recommendations and respond in full.
The Prime Minister mentions vetting, and I just want to press on that because serious failures in police vetting were raised in independent reports as long ago as 2012, 2019, 2022 and 2023. And that's why Labour's been arguing for mandatory national vetting standards, which would stop anybody with a history of domestic abuse or sexual offending being allowed to join the police in the first place. Why are mandatory national vetting standards not already in place?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is vital for public confidence that those that are not fit to wear the badge are rooted out of the police and not able to join in the first place. That's why the College of Policing has updated its existing statutory code on vetting, and that happened quickly. And in addition, the Policing Inspectorate, Mr. Speaker, carried out a rapid inspection of all forces' progress against the previous findings. And in addition to that, an entire check against the National Police Database was carried out for all serving officers and staff.
Mr. Speaker, I'm obviously very familiar with codes in criminal justice systems, but this is too serious for that. There's a world of difference between a code and binding mandatory standards, which don't have legal effect, and that should trouble members across the House. Cousins' history of sexual offending stretched back many years. On 4 occasions, despite allegations of indecent exposure, he wasn't sacked. We know indecent exposure is a gateway to more horrific crimes, as was tragically shown to be the case not only in Sarah Everard's case, but also Libby Squire. But it's not treated with the seriousness required. The Angelina report recommends reviewing all indecent exposure allegations against serving officers in order to identify, investigate and remove those officers from service. Now, given the obvious urgency of this recommendation, can the Prime Minister give a categorical assurance that it will be implemented immediately?
Mr. Speaker, as the Home Secretary addressed this specifically when he made his statement, indecent exposure, just like any other kind of sexually motivated crime, is abhorrent. And we expect police chiefs to take it extremely seriously. We fully expect police chiefs to suspend an officer charged with any kind of sexually motivated crime. And it's worth pointing out, in addition to the new powers that the Home Secretary outlined about automatic suspension, Chief Constables already do have existing powers to suspend any officer in their force when allegations are made, and we fully expect them to use those powers.
It's all fine, is it? It's all okay?
Well, I do think the recommendation I referred to should be implemented urgently, and ask the Prime Minister to look again at that, because every day that goes past when it isn't implemented carries risk for victims in these cases. Sarah Everard's murder should, of course, been a watershed moment on policing reform, on the criminal justice system, on violence against women and girls. But the sad reality is that victims of rape who have the courage and bravery to come forward have just a 2.4% chance of their perpetrators being caught and charged within the year. How does the Prime Minister expect women to have confidence in the criminal justice system when almost all rapists don't see the inside of a courtroom?
Mr. Speaker, as we acknowledged a couple of years ago, of course we need to do more to improve rape outcomes in the criminal justice system. And the plan, the Rape Action Review Plan, is showing considerable progress, Mr. Speaker. We've already increased the average sentences for rape by a third since Labour were last in office, Mr. Speaker. By the way, using a power that the Labour Party voted against in this House. And thanks to our action plan, we've seen police referrals double, charges double, and last year there was a 50% increase in rape convictions, and now rapists will serve every single day of their sentence behind bars. And the honourable gentleman did raise his time at the Crown Prosecution Service, but he hasn't acknowledged that under his tenure, rape convictions actually dropped.
Well, the Prime Minister knows that is going to be fact-checked. He also knows I support tough sentences. I really do think that the victims of violence against women and girls deserve better than this nonsense from the Prime Minister. It needs to be taken seriously. It's not games, Prime Minister. We all want more victims to come forward, but we have to be honest. Unless things change, the criminal justice system will continue to fail them. That's why we're committed to introducing specialist rape and sexual offences teams in every force to give victims specialist support and confidence that their experience will be investigated properly. When will the Prime Minister commit to doing the same?
Mr. Speaker, we've already implemented a Rape Action Review Plan. He says about taking this seriously. Here are the things that we have done, Mr. Speaker. We have ended the appalling digital strip search that victims had to go through with their mobile phones. We've ensured that there's better use of pre-recorded cross-examination. We've rolled out Operation Sorteria with incredible success across all national police forces, and we have increased significantly the number of independent sexual, domestic violence and abuse advisors to up to 1,000, and there is more specialist training in all police forces for these prosecutions. That is a plan that we've already put in place. It's a plan that is working to ensure that we can keep women and girls in our country safe.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is the rosy picture the Prime Minister tries to paint of the current criminal justice system is completely at odds with the confidence many women currently have in it. And with the publication of the Angelina report, the country deserves to know that we're doing all we can to make our country safe for women. That starts with what should be the most basic task, creating a safe workplace here in Westminster. And at the moment, as everyone in this House knows, we are failing in that endeavour, and we all have a duty to change this. So when will he make time for the vote on banning from Parliament MPs who face allegations of sex offences?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely right that we ensure our communities are safe for women and girls. That's why we passed the landmark Domestic Abuse Act. That's why we set up a new 24/7 victim support line. It's why we've quadrupled funding for victim support, and why we are investing in practical things like CCTV and better street lighting in safer communities up and down the country. Now, of course, there is always more we can do, but this government has a strong track record in ensuring that women across this country will feel safe.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I want the Prime Minister to know that the people of Romford are struggling with ever-increasing energy prices, yet providers are making huge profits, running into hundreds of millions. So, does the Prime Minister agree with me that reductions in wholesale prices should be passed on to the consumers and standing charges brought down, And will the government hold utility companies to account for their actions?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight the challenge that high energy bills have posed, not just to his constituents in Romford, but across the country. That's why we stepped in with a significant package of support, paying for around half of a typical household energy bill when prices were at their highest. My honourable friend, I know, will join me in welcoming the fact that the energy price cap is set to fall by almost £250 in April, which will bring relief to many families, but we must hold companies to account, and that's why we introduced the energy profits levy on the windfall profits caused by an unexpected increase in energy prices, and we are going further to cut costs for people by cutting their taxes and putting more money in their family bank accounts.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, much to my surprise this morning, it's been widely reported that the Conservative Party in Scotland are absolutely furious that Westminster is about to tax Scotland's natural resources in order to pay for a tax cut in England. Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister in danger of turning his colleagues into nationalists?
Mr. Speaker, obviously I wouldn't comment on the budget, but what I would say is, when I was in Scotland last week, it was crystal clear. There has only ever been one party consistently standing up for the North Sea energy industry, and it's the Scottish Conservatives.
The Prime Minister knows that not to be the case, but there's a serious point to be made here, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party want to use Scotland's natural resources to pay for tax cuts in England. The Labour Party want to use Scotland's natural resources to pay for nuclear power stations in England, and the cost of that up to 100,000 jobs. Scotland's wealth, Scotland's resources, Scotland's jobs, all a game to Westminster. But with the Tories on just 15% in the polls in Scotland now, will the Prime Minister do us all a favour and call a general election?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman claims to be supportive of the North Sea energy industry. Why is it that he's opposed all the measures that we have taken to protect those jobs in Scotland over the past couple of years? He talks about tax in Scotland and England. I'll just gently point out to him that thanks to the actions of the Chancellor and this UK government, everyone in Scotland has received a significant tax cut from January this year. And in contrast to the Chancellor's last budget, the SNP's budget put taxes up for working Scots. Scotland is now the high tax capital of the UK, but this Conservative government is going to keep cutting taxes for hard-working Scots.
Speaker, the government is rightly acting to properly compensate the Horizon victims who are highlighted by Alan Bates's legal challenge. However, there are thousands more sub-postmasters across the country who are not actually prosecuted, but who faced financial penalties for bogus shortfalls, causing enormous financial and personal distress to them. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we should now be doing everything possible to do right by all victims of gross miscarriage of justice, clear their names, and at last properly financially compensate them?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the appalling impact this miscarriage of justice has had on people's mental health. As he acknowledged, our focus is on delivering justice for the postmasters, and that's why we will introduce legislation to overturn convictions and pave the way for the swift payment of compensation, which he acknowledged. But I thank my honourable friend for his long-standing campaign on this issue about mental health, and I can assure him that the Postal Minister is closely examining the issues he raises. He's considering next steps and will keep the right honourable gentleman closely informed.
Sir Geoffrey Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that the Government's proposals to deal with the legacy of our troubled past in Northern Ireland continue to be the subject of scrutiny, most recently in the High Court ruling in relation to compatibility with our human rights obligations. And yet, many families of victims in Northern Ireland are deeply disappointed with the lack of cooperation by the Irish Government in relation to murders committed in their jurisdiction or from their jurisdiction. In relation to the Omagh bomb inquiry, for example, the Irish Government has declined to conduct a public inquiry on this worst atrocity in our troubled past, despite the courts urging it to do so. Will the Prime Minister continue to press the Irish Government on the need for them to make available facilities to enable the families of innocent victims, including in Omagh, to pursue justice for their loved ones?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question on this important topic, which I know will be of great interest not just to his constituents but many others across Northern Ireland. The government has set forward its plans to deal with the legacy of the past and will continue to engage with everyone in Northern Ireland, whatever their views, to set out the best way forward. But I can confirm to him that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has raised these specific issues directly with the Irish government and will continue to do so. And I also spoke to the Taoiseach myself about this very matter. We would hope to see further cooperation on Omagh and many other outstanding cases that involve Irish jurisdiction, because like him, I want to give families as much information as possible.
Hello, Plesty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Putin's put the Russian economy on a total war footing. He has increased military spending by 68% to 7.5% of GDP. He claimed this month that over 520,000 new jobs have been created in their arms industry, which now employs an estimated 3.5 million Russians. On my recent visits to Ukraine, I've met with government ministers and senior military figures who have expressed great frustration to me about the length of time it is taking to develop collaboration in building a defence manufacturing capability jointly with UK defence companies in Ukraine. So will my honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can unblock the bureaucracy and, as our Ukrainian friends say, build the arsenal of the free world together?
Well, I can reassure my honourable friend that we remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine, and we will not allow Putin to achieve his aim of eradicating Ukrainian freedom and democracy. Our cross-government task force is working diligently to support both the armed forces of Ukraine and lead UK and Ukrainian defence industrial cooperation. I'm pleased to say in December last year we conducted our first successful trade mission to Ukraine alongside the UK defence industry, but I can tell him that the government and UK industry will continue to work hand in glove with our Ukrainian allies, seizing the opportunities for collaboration and bolstering our joint defence industries.
Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, last week the IPPR published a paper, The State of the North. That paper predicted that wealth inequalities, already too large between the North and the South East, would increase to nearly £250,000 per head by the end of this decade. Does the Prime Minister accept that his levelling up agenda has failed, or did he never want it to succeed?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, inequality in our country has actually declined under this Conservative government. And when it comes to levelling up in the North, it's actually the North that has received some of the highest amounts of per capita levelling up funding of any region in the country. And I know when he last popped up to ask me a question about our investment in the North, I was wondering if he's managed to get an answer as to what exactly the Labour Party's position on HS2 is. Because I'd still like to know, because what we're doing is taking that money and reinvesting every penny of it across the North in forms of transportation that people use every day, delivering benefits quicker to communities not just in his constituency, but across the entire North, and it's been warmly welcomed everywhere that I've been.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the performance of the Labour Party in voting down our Rwanda bill in the House of Lords is a disgrace? It is only the Conservative government and the Conservatives who have a plan for dealing with illegal immigration and the people's fund. Action on illegal immigration is a top priority in my constituency, and Labour has no policy or plan on this at all.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. He knows, like I know, that if you want to fully stop the boats, you need to have a working deterrent. That means if someone comes here illegally, you must be able to remove them to a safe third country alternative. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important, and that's why we're determined to see it through. But it was just in the last week an independent report was published talking about the Labour Party's policies in this area, which made it crystal clear that they don't have a plan to stop the boats, and in fact their idea would see the UK accept hundreds of thousands more migrants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Which part of his economic legacy is the Prime Minister most proud of? Is it presiding over the highest tax burden since the Second World War? Or is it delivering the slowest real wage growth since the Napoleonic War?
Mr. Speaker, saving 10 million jobs in the pandemic with the furlough scheme.
The Prime Minister will know that there is consensus across this House on the need to build new houses. Where that consensus breaks down is where those houses should be built. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that wherever possible, new houses should be built on brownfield sites, not on green spaces, not on greenfield, and certainly not on prime farmland?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It's sustainable planning that must be at the heart of our planning system, and that's why we're committed to meeting the needs of communities by building homes in the right places and, as he says, making best use of brownfield land. We've made it clear that that's what should be the priority. We've put extra funding aside to unlock those sites, and our recent changes to the MPPF provide clearer protection for the Greenbelt, making it clear how future housing supply should be assessed. And that is the clear difference between our two parties. On this side of the House, we will protect the Greenbelt, and the Labour Party will concrete right all over it.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in some jurisdictions, ministers routinely publish their tax returns. The Prime Minister voluntarily published his UK tax returns last year. Does the Prime Minister agree that ministers of the Crown should publish their tax returns as a matter of course? And has he ever filed any returns in the USA that have not been published?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think that would be proportionate or appropriate. And what I've done is... I don't think it would be proportionate for all ministers to publish their tax returns. In keeping with a long-standing tradition, I voluntarily published my tax return, as did the Chancellor. I think that is the right balance, and I've been completely transparent about that as I've done it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, a number of us were on the first transatlantic flight powered by sustainable aviation fuel. This week, IAG made its first major purchase of that fuel. But that fuel is coming from the United States. And it's really important that we have a SAF industry in this country. So will the Prime Minister tell the Treasury and the Department of Transport to accelerate the work they're doing, to put in place the right framework and the right support mechanisms to ensure we have a SAF industry for our aviation sector for the future?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend for his championing of this cause, which I think is absolutely right, and reassure him that we are committed to ensuring that the SAF mandate is in place in 2025. That will require about 10% of jet fuel to be made from sustainable feedstock by 2030. And to get there, we've provided, I'm pleased to tell him, £135 million to 13 different UK sustainable aviation fuel projects to kickstart our domestic industry. And, which he also knows is important, we've committed to introducing a revenue certainty mechanism to support SAF production in the UK as soon as practically possible.
Sam Dixon.
Thank you. Chester's 2,000-year-old Roman walls are an important historic monument of world renown. Will the PM join me in Chester to walk the walls and explore how the government can support the upkeep of these important structures, which, unlike the Conservative Party, are stable, solid, and in no danger of imminent collapse?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I join the honourable lady in paying tribute to the history of her local community, and I'm pleased that the City of Chester is benefiting from so much investment from the Conservative government so that it can maintain its local infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5 weeks ago, Conservative MPs from across South East London and Kent wrote to Transport for London and the Labour Mayor of London, calling on them to do the right thing following the botched implementation of a temporary 40-mile-an-hour speed limit on the A20 near Sidcup, which has seen thousands of drivers unfairly issued fines and points on their licence. This has left many drivers, including carers, emergency service workers and teachers, at risk of losing their licences and jobs. This is despite travelling less than 50-mile-an-hour zones. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that TfL, the Met Police and Sadiq Khan must come clean about the number of fines and cancel these issued points?
Can I thank my honourable friend for this question, and I do understand the concerns that local drivers have over this ongoing TfL issue. Whilst we're doing everything we can to back motorists across the country, it is disappointing that the Labour Mayor and indeed Labour-run Wales are hammering drivers at every opportunity, whether that's temporary speed limits or blanket 20-mile-an-hour zones or the ULEZ expansion. But I will make sure that my honourable friend has a meeting with a responsible minister to discuss his concerns.
Judith Cummings.
Mr. Speaker, to strengthen current spiking legislation, forensic evidence is essential. The NHS does not have uniform policy for the screening of suspected victims of spiking at A&E. We can pass all the laws we want in this place, but to achieve justice, this forensic evidence is vital. Will the Prime Minister commit to ensuring that hospital emergency departments have a statutory obligation to take forensic samples from these victims?
I agree with the honourable lady that spiking is an appalling, violating crime which seriously undermines public safety, particularly the safety of women and girls, and we want to make sure that the existing laws recognise the threat that spiking poses, and that's why at the end of last year we announced a raft of new measures to confront spiking and support victims, including changing the law to make it clear without any doubt that spiking is illegal, as well as other measures like an online reporting tool, investing in research and rapid testing kits, and training for bar staff. But I'll ensure that we look into the issue that she raises and write back to her.
Final question, Ben Bradley.
This winter, flood and storm damage has caused significant damage to the infrastructure in and around my Mansfield constituency. That's our roads, it's our drains, it's flood infrastructure, and this is among the highest concern that residents raise with me on a regular basis. I'm really grateful that from next year in particular, there's very significant infrastructure funding coming our way. But what can my right honourable friend do to help fix this for my constituents now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that in 2020 we announced that we would double our flood investment to a record £5.2 billion, and in Nottinghamshire since 2010 we've invested over £50 million to protect 15,000 properties, and I know currently there is a programme in Mansfield which is looking at surface water and drainage improvements, but I will make sure that I talk to the Chancellor that we have a strong economy to keep investing in local infrastructure in his area, and that's exactly what we're about to hear from my right honourable friend in just a second.
Completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, you heard there Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, saying that completed Prime Minister's questions. It's always a little bit different. The PMQ's just ahead of the budget. He has vacated the chair for the Deputy Speaker, Eleanor Lang. There she is, presiding over the budget, as is traditional and normal, as the Chairman of Ways and Means. She will be going through some of the notices ahead of Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, delivering his budget statement. He'll take to his feet shortly and will probably speak for about an hour, perhaps a little bit less, and then it will be, of course, the turn of the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, to respond. We will take both of those live and uninterrupted, and we will then have reaction from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, part of the Treasury team, and her shadow for Labour. Here's Jeremy Hunt.
Madam